Well, hello everybody. This is going to be the notes for my presentations for the Cold War. Okay, so this would be Cold War Notes Part 2. If you've already looked at the first set of notes, Part 1, they were meant to help you answer questions 1 to 4. And so this presentation goes after that. Okay, so take a listen here and I'll go over some of the key ideas and concepts about the Cold War. Okay, well, number 1 here, you see a word, a vocab word that I want everybody to be aware of here, and it's the word containment. Now, you may be able to get some sense of what containment is if you just understand, one of the roots. Think of the word contain. Think of a container. If you had a container filled with water or something, it would be the thing that, keeps the water from spilling out and getting all over the place. And that's a good metaphor and way of understanding this U.S. policy. The United States wants to contain the Soviet Union. We don't want them to spread all over and spread their communism all over the world. We want to contain them. Keep them where they already are. Just don't let them out. Okay, so if you notice here, we have a bear, and the bear has traditionally been the symbol for Russia, much like an eagle has traditionally been the symbol of the United States, or in this case, it's Uncle Sam. Sometimes we use symbols to represent countries. In this case, the bear is meant to be Russia, and Russia is the dominant part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union, or if you just want to call it, Communist Russia, some of the things like that. But that's what the bear is. Okay, so the bear is meant to be a metaphor. Don't think literally. It's not a real bear. It's a symbol for all of the things that the communists are supposed to be trying to spread. Communism, right? All right, so who is behind this strategy? Well, the United States is all about trying to keep the bear in there thanks to Harry Truman. He had a doctrine, he had a bunch of advisors who suggested that the best way to try to deal with Stalin and to deal with the communists is just to try and prevent them from spreading. Any country that needs our help, we'll help them. Any country that's resisting communism, we will throw in money and aid and sometimes even troops to apply the pressure to keep that bear in the Soviet Union so that the communists don't get out and say, hey, you should become communist. Hey, you should become communist. Hey, you should become communist, etc. That's what we're trying to do. And after World War II, it becomes a global concern. And we will be fighting the Soviet Union through a number of what are called proxy wars. The most famous are probably in Korea and Vietnam, as we try to help out like the South Koreans, so that the South Koreans don't get run over by the North Koreans, and then all of Korea will become part of the Soviet, in the Soviet sphere. We don't want that. Similarly, we do the same in Vietnam. We try to prop up the Vietnamese, our allies in Vietnam. That one didn't work out so well, as we'll see later on. But this is what containment is. It's a U.S. policy, a strategy to stop the spread of communism. All right. How'd that work out? Not so well. Here we see that containing communism, and certainly one of the first major places, failed miserably. This was a big pickup for Stalin. He was able to support the Chinese communists led by this bozo, Chairman Mao Zedong. And China became, and still is today, a communist country, the most powerful and certainly the biggest communist country that's still around today. Although what they mean by communism is quite a bit different from what they meant about communism back then. Back then, they were trying to be true believers of communism with no private property and the state running everything. And you know, traditional, old school, Stalinist kind of communism. And this guy, Mao, oh boy, he's a bad guy. You can see right down here, 60 million Chinese, okay, killing his own people through bad policies, starvation. A lot of his people just starved to death because the communists could not feed their own people. They took all their private property away. They took all their farms away. They just put them to work on like communal farms. And it just was very inefficient. And then they had natural disasters and millions died. They also tried to industrialize. That means make factories really quick and tried to become very, very advanced very quick. Because back in this day, this was the late 40s, early 50s, China was still a very much what we call a peasant based society with, peasants who were, farmers who were traditional and had always been, peasants and had always, been that way. And now they're going to be told, nope, you're going to become communists. Some of them resisted. Those that resisted were crushed. And so this guy, oh boy, you'll hear more about him, and you'll hear more about Chinese communism in your senior year. I know in high school, one of the big units they have is they have an economic class. So you'll take economics, and you'll be comparing, what is a market economy and what is a command economy, and you'll use Chinese communism, and you'll get a sense of just how awful the communist economy was, and the political leaders, and all of the death and destruction they inflict upon their own people. But the key thing that I want you to take away from this is this was a surprise. America did not see this coming. We were shocked that China went communist. How did it go red? Red, again, means communist. How did Stalin put this in the win column for him? We were supposed to contain him and stop him from spreading, but we didn't, and China becomes communist. We had some Chinese allies. They had to flee. They went off to a little island over here called Taiwan, where they're still there today. And they had to flee the mainland of China. And we were so shocked by this because, during World War II, China was our ally. Japan had attacked China, and we were supporting the Chinese against the Japanese. And once the Japanese got booted out after World War II, we thought, okay, well, now China will become a democratic republic just like us. And nope, that didn't happen. And so this really shocked lots of people in the United States and made them wonder, how did China go red? Did we not see this coming? Did we not have, the amount of spies and intelligence officers there to be able to know that this was really going to happen? And so a lot of people in the United States were starting to point fingers at who knew? Why didn't we know? How did we allow this to happen? So this is going to lead later to a rise of a guy named McCarthy. More on him later. But this was a big, big shock. All right. Now, one of the other things that we see going on in this time is that the world starts to become divided into, really three different categories. The first category is called the First World. Okay. First world powers are those that are allied with us. So you can see Canada and Western Europe and all throughout this region here colored in blue. These are generally Western oriented. They tend to have democracy. They tend to have free markets, capitalism, and ultimately many of them will go ahead and join an alliance that I'll talk about a little bit here. The NATO alliance, that was part of a lot of the First World. Well, the Second World were the people who were part of the Soviet alliance system called the Warsaw Pact. You may remember both this NATO and Warsaw Pact from the first lecture here. Well, what about the rest of the world? Well, the rest of the world, if you're not in the First World, okay, or in the Second World, Well, that by default says now everybody else is known as the third world. Okay, today they don't like to be called that. And so you won't find a lot of countries saying, hey, we're down here in Africa or Central America or wherever. We don't like to be called, the third world anymore. What do you want to be called? Developing countries. Okay, so today that's kind of what you hear today, that these countries are called developing. But back then, the third world was how people referred to any country that wasn't part of these two big blocks, either the second or the first world, the communists or democratic nations, the third world. And really, these countries throughout the world are how the United States is going to compete with the Soviet Union. We want everybody to join our side, and the Soviets want everybody to join their side. And sometimes countries in the third world don't want to pick. Sometimes they try to navigate a very narrow road between both of us and try to say, oh, we don't want to be part of your block, and we don't want to be part of your block either. We want to kind of go our own way. All right, but there's a lot of pressure on every country around the world to choose a side and become part of one of these. We'll say, we'll give you a bunch of aid and money and be like us. And they'll say, no, we'll give you a bunch of aid and money. We want you to be like us. As it happens, we have more money, and so we're able to give a lot more aid and money and resources to a lot of countries around the world. Some of the countries, quite frankly, are not very friendly countries, but we give them money and aid just to keep them on our side. And these days, we probably look back at some of the countries that we gave money and aid to, and there were some pretty nasty dictators that we gave money and support and aid to just because they weren't communist, and so we were able to kind of overlook, some of their failures and some of their really bad things that they did to their own people. Some of these were, dictatorships in South America and Central America that did really bad things, awful things to their own people. And people would call us out and say, "Oh, America, how do you support these awful dictators in South America?" And we'd say, "Well, at least they're not communists." Well, all right. But Soviets would do the same thing. They would prop up and give dictatorships in their own, mirror image. They would do the same thing. So this was that time in world history where we tended to kind of go black and white and say, well, we're going to support anybody who's not a communist. And that was what containment was. Oh, you're not a communist? Okay, we'll support you so that we can keep the bear in there. Remember, don't let the bear out. Don't spread communism. Stop him wherever. All right. Last slide I'm going to be talking about today is how you fight a war when you can't fight a war. I know that sounds kind of weird, but we all know that if the United States and the Soviet Union fight a war directly, we kill the world. We will blow up the entire world. The entire world will die. Every man, women, children, animal, plant, you name it, we have the power to kill the world. And we both know that. And so the United States and Soviet Union are, still enemies, and we're still competing for influence around the world. But if we can't fight each other, then how do we fight? Well, here's how. We have what are called proxy wars. Proxy is going to be something you'll need to know. A proxy is like a group of people or a country that we support. So we support the South Koreans. Okay, we say, oh, you South Koreans down here, we support you. You are our proxies. We're going to give you aid and military equipment and training and advice and you name it. Up here in the north, those are going to be the folks who are proxies for the Soviet Union and China. They're going to be, able to be supported by Stalin and Mao and all of the communists, etc. So this is what I mean. We each support one side. United States and the UN are going to support South Korea. China and Russia support North Korea. But we're not fighting the Soviets directly, okay? We're going to be fighting the North Koreans, and the North Koreans are going to get a lot of aid, and tanks and guns and bombs from the Soviet Union and China. But the whole point is if we fight Stalin directly, we can go into a third world war. So this is what I say, an indirect war, okay? If we end up fighting a direct war, then it becomes hot. It's not a Cold War anymore, it is a hot war. It's going to be a nuclear war. We're going to start lobbing nuclear weapons at each other. And it won't just be confined to nuclear weapons here. It's going to be over in Europe. It's going to be in the United States. It's going to be in the Soviet Union. It's going to be around the world. It won't just be confined to the borders here if we end up fighting Stalin directly. That's why we can't do it. We must avoid that at all costs. We know that. And so this is kind of how we end up fighting in the Korean War. We're going to support the South. Soviets and China will support the North. Now I'm going to be giving you guys a little video that will go into the details of how this war begins, as North Korea gets support and they attack South Korea. And then there's a bit of a yo-yo back and forth over this line, the 38th parallel. And the war goes back and forth for a while. At one point, goes all the way down to the little tip of South Korea before we get involved, and then we push the North Koreans all the way back up to China, and then Chinese throw in some of their aid, and then they push us back down, and then it stabilizes very much in a similar place to where it all began. So this is going to be the Korean War, and more on that. You'll see a bit of a video on that later, which will show you how that all panned out. But just understand, this is an example of a proxy war. All right, well, that's all I have for you today. If you need to make sure to break this as well as the earlier one up into chunks, and take a look at the questions on the notes page that correspond to these things that I just went over. Okay, so look at the notes page and see the ones that have to do with what containment is, what Chinese communism is, the nature of the first, second, and third world, and proxy wars in Korea, etc. These that I've gone over will help you answer many of those questions. Okay, that's it for now.